Why take no prisoners? Why spare no name? Nobody's putting up a fight. I'll take my bed, I'm gonna take it here. Satan get ya, Satan get ya. House bells, those house bells, house bells, the house bells. Come on.
When AC/DC decided, after Bon Scott's death, that they were going to bring in a new man, I think they faced the inevitable dilemma any band always faces when they try and replace a vocalist. Any successful band face, which is, do you go for someone in a similar mould and run the risk, therefore, of this person living in the shadow of their predecessor, or do you go for someone completely different and run the risk of taking the band in such a different direction the diehards don't really understand or appreciate it? Now, AC/DC actually, from what I understand, came down to a short list of about 4 different vocalists from whom they chose the final man. There was Steve Wright, who'd been in a band called the Easy Beats. I think his problem was that he was in the band with Harry Vanda and George Young, the producers of DC in their early days, and perhaps a little bit too close to home. Gary Holton of the Heavy Metal Kids was another one who was very much in the frame. Later went on to find fame with Auf Wiedersehen Pet, the TV sitcom, before sadly dying. His problem was too much of a personality, too much of a larger-than-life character, ergo Bon Scott. Another one was a guy called Alan Fryer from Heaven, an Australian band, quite a moderately successful Australian band, who featured at one point Mark Evans, the original AC/DC bassist. And the fourth choice was Brian Johnson.
Brian Johnson was the ideal choice as the replacement to Bon Scott. His credentials were, he'd come from a band called Geordie, who hadn't really got anywhere. But they also had been, I think their career had kind of stalled up to that point.
Nowadays people sort of say, oh yes, you know, the ex-Geordie singer. It's like, well, quite frankly, in 1980, when Bon Scott died, no one knew who the hell Geordie were.
Well, Brian Johnson was very much an unknown before he joined AC/DC, although the most bizarre element of it is that Bon Scott actually recommended him to the other members of AC/DC. At some point in the late 70s, he'd been to see Brian's old band Geordie, and Bon had, and saw a gig where Brian was rolling around on the floor screaming his head off, and he came back raving to the rest of AC/DC saying, if ever I was out of the band, you've got to get this guy in because he's brilliant. He said it's the best Little Richard impression he's ever seen. And it was only later he found out that Brian had appendicitis, which is why he was rolling around screaming.
Brian Johnson's career had hit its uppers, really. He had nowhere really to go, had a great gruff voice that fitted very well into what DC had done and what they wanted to do. But he was also a man who could be very much a part of the band and very much subservient to what Angus and Malcolm Young wanted to achieve. And I think that made him the choice.
AC/DC needed to keep the momentum going in their career because their lead singer had died. Now, for most bands, that would be the end of the band. But somehow Brian Johnson managed to fill Bon Scott's shoes, which is unheard of in rock and roll, totally unheard of. And he actually managed to live up to Bon Scott's name somehow. It's a unique story in music.
What still amazes me to this day is the speed it was done. Bon Scott died on February the 19th, 1980. Brian Johnson was announced that is officially on April the 8th, 1980. Less than 7 weeks later.
That's frighteningly quick, you know, and opens them up to potential allegations that they didn't give a shit that Bon was dead, they were going to carry on regardless. Now, I don't believe that for a minute.
It's an interesting question as to whether Brian Johnson was sort of dancing on Bon Scott's grave.
It was surprising the speed with which Bon Scott was replaced in AC/DC. I think it caught a lot of people unawares.
I don't think the fans were ever going to be ready for Bon to be replaced by, by another singer, because Bon was, as much as Angus was the great symbol of AC/DC, you know, he was the front man, and he was just such a hugely popular character.
Bon Scott had such a reputation that for anyone else to replace Bon Scott, I just don't think it would have worked. And it would have looked like a cash-in.
Maybe they threw themselves into the thick of it very quickly just to get over the grief
The word was that they'd approached Bon Scott's family and said, we want to carry on with the band, and the family had no problem with it.
It was Bon's father who suggested to the band that they should continue without Bon and with a new singer. So I think if you get the blessing from the family, then it's only right that they should continue.
I don't think it was too soon, because AC/DC at that point had just started making headway outside Australia.
AC/DC, they've been together for many years at this point, and it's very much the brothers' band. It's Malcolm and Angus's band. You know, Bon Scott hadn't been the first singer in AC/DC. Originally, he'd started off driving their van for them. You know, he was several years older than them, and initially it was like, well, why would he be joining? So I think it was their band, they decided to get on with it. I don't think it's a mark of disrespect to Bon Scott. You know, they were starting to sell a lot of records, they had a career, was really beginning, and I think they just wanted to get straight back into it again.
In hindsight, of course, it worked, because Brian Johnson came in, they did Back in Black, not just the biggest album of their career, but one of the biggest albums of all time in any genre of music. So it worked.
It was Brian Johnson that took AC/DC onto the next level, really, commercially, and they started to make headway outside Australia, which was the key. You're never going to make a career in Australia. And they started to make headway in England, or rather Britain, and in the States. And then they started to explode. So it's interesting, because I can't think of anyone else that could have replaced Bon Scott without looking like.
It has to be said that in a nearly 35-year history, nothing is more controversial as far as AC/DC are concerned than Bon Scott's perceived or imagined role with Back in Black.
There is constant debate over lyrics and whether any material was recorded.
A lot of people say that Bon Scott had written the majority of the lyrics, I think, on Back in Black, but the band deny this.
The credits on the album are only for the Angus and Malcolm Young, and also I think for Brian Johnson as well. But you do tend to think that some of the lyrics, certain lyrics, stuff like Have a Drink on Me, maybe what do you do for money, honey? A lot of the time you sometimes think they read more like Bon Scott's lyrics than Brian Johnson's, but they may have just been written by the others in the style of Bon Scott.
Bon was exceptionally funny, very, very witty. He could get away with anything. He could say the most sexist thing, and a lot of women, it'd be like Phil Lynott from Thin Lizzy, a lot of women didn't find that offensive when Bon said it, because he was just a charmer. He was, you know, he was a bit of a dirty old git, and I think they liked that with him. And there's a lot of that humour in the lyrics to some of the songs from Back in Black. I mean, Have a Drink on Me, if that was written, I could understand that being written by Bon, but if it was written by Brian as a sort of tip of the hat to Bon, then it's pretty tasteless, really, but quite funny, and maybe Bon would have thought that would be quite funny anyway.
I know that Bon had worked on some lyrics. Now, AC/DC themselves have admitted in certain cases some of these were just lines that they used, you know, on built songs around them. You Shook Me All Night Long, obviously, is the one that I know that certain people have seen, or was shown by Bon at the time.
I saw a sheaf of papers on which Bon was scribbling ideas for lyrics for the album that was to be Back in Black. Now, memory can play a few tricks on you, but I'm sure I saw the line, "She told me to come, but I was already there," which is in You Shook Me All Night Long. I'm sure I saw it. And I saw other lines in there which were to turn up on songs from the album. I am not saying Bon wrote all the lyrics. I'm not even saying he wrote close to all the lyrics. I'm saying he had an input.
Maybe it was out of trying to give Brian as good a start in the band as possible to not give Bon any credits on the album, because then if Back in Black comes out and it says Bon Scott on the co-writing credits, it's going to look a bit lame. It's going to look like this new guy is singing Bon stuff. He's really stepping on the legacy a bit there. Maybe it was just decided that even if some money went to the Bon Scott estate, that they would at least make a clean break and call it Brian's album.
Why AC/DC have never given him credit, I don't know. You'd have to ask them. I suspect it's the closing of the ranks. I suspect they wanted Brian Johnson to be accepted as the man wholly responsible. But even think about the fact on April the 8th, 1980, he was announced as being in the band. The album was finished several weeks later. You're not going to tell me he was mega fast in writing all his lyrics almost off the top of his head. No. I am convinced, and I know Bon had an input.
There's also supposedly tapes around, which you hear about quite often and which various people claim to have heard. And I don't know whether it's true or not. There's definitely some fakes, but stories of Bon Scott doing Back in Black, definitely Back in Black, the title track, maybe one other. I'm not entirely sure.
Those of you who believe there is a Back in Black demo with Bon Scott, turn off right now, because guess what? There is none. And I'll tell you why I know. Because the songs weren't ready. They were very much in an embryonic state. They weren't even close to getting ready to demo songs at the time that Bon died. That's just daft and stupid. The other thing is, think about it logically. 26 years on, do you really, really believe if a demo exists of Bon Scott singing the Back in Black songs, it would have remained undiscovered? Come on. I remember a few months ago, somebody sent me an MP3 of what they claimed, this is it, this is Back in Black, this is Bon Scott singing. And you listen to it, and other people who are AC/DC fans have listened to it as well. It's obviously not Bon, and it's obviously not AC/DC. It's a covers band. That demo does not exist.
Bon was quite a tidy drummer himself, so he actually demoed a couple of the tracks with him on drums and the rest of the band playing while Phil Rudd was out of the country or something for a while. So there's two tracks there, Have a Drink on Me and Let Me Put My Love Into You, which were demoed with Bon on drums.
I think his shadow very much hangs over that album very, very heavily. But it's not his work.